Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. This is the second video in this Intro to React series. And in this video, we're going to be talking about one, how to write components, and two, writing JSX. So again, a component is literally just any function that returns JSX. So it's a function, and then its return value is basically just these types of this kind of HTML-like syntax. Okay, and first things first, literally any function can be it. So I could actually write a component. I could have two components in the same file, so I can just write another function. We can call it hello. So again, whatever the function's name is what the component's name is. And then I can just return like an h1. So I'll return an h1 that says hello world. So literally it returns HTML. Okay, think about it that way. It's a function that returns HTML. And then by doing that, I can now use that as a component. So instead of writing the h1 hello world here, I can now replace it with this. Okay, so when it sees this, so basically it looks like an HTML tag, but typically we'll do it self-closing. Okay, so you see I put a little slash at the end of the that tag. But basically, React is going to know, oh, I'm looking for a function called hello. Okay, there is hello. And then basically the return value is what should be injected here. Okay, that's kind of basically how the component works. So if I were to run this npm, and actually let's make a branch, git checkout -b video 2. Okay, npm run start. So we'll run the server so you can see what's happening on the screen. And you can see hello world is still there because it's showing up from here. Okay, because again, whenever React sees this, it knows, hey, let me run the function by that same name and inject whatever that function is returning right there in that HTML. That's essentially all a component is. And by doing this, I can run it. And the cool thing about this is I can use it multiple times. Okay, so I have this component hello. I don't have to write the whole thing over again. So now this is like me having to, I can write that, and that whole code is there twice. Okay, this is great when you're talking about pre-styled buttons or carousels or other things that you may be using multiple times on the page at the same time or in different contexts. It allows us to have that reusability. Okay, so we can encapsulate something like a carousel into one component and then be able to reuse it multiple times. And that's a really nice thing about this component-based infrastructure that frameworks like React, Vue, Solid.js, Svelte, Angular do for us with this kind of component-based design. Okay, so simple as that. Now, typically, the common practice isn't to write multiple components in the same file. Okay, we're typically going to write them in separate files, so that way each component has its own file. But I'm going to show you a couple other things you can do. Just so you're aware, again, any function defined anywhere can be a component. Okay, so I could sit there and say, hey, literally write another function inside the app function called cheese. Okay, and it can return an h2 that says cheese. Okay, and I can use that as a component. Okay, and then that should work. And so we see the cheese right there. Now, a couple of reasons why you want to be careful when you do this. This can be useful in certain situations, but oftentimes you probably want to avoid it. Because then what's going to happen is that anytime the app component is being rebuilt, it's going to redefine this cheese component. So you're going to end up defining the same component over and over and over and over again, which is not necessarily really what you want. On top of it, it's only usable inside this component. Okay, it doesn't exist outside of it because just normal scoping. So again, anything defined inside of a function only really exists in that function. Okay, so you typically wouldn't do this. But just to show you that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where the function comes from. If there's a function in scope that returns JSX, it can be used as a component in the JSX of another component. Okay, so I will get rid of that. We don't really want that. I'm going to get rid of this cheese over here. Okay, so now let's show you how usually people would make their components in separate files. So typically what happened is that you would create a folder a new folder called components. So always in the source folder, you create a folder called components. It's just sort of the standard way. Does it have to be that? No, this is just sort of, again, the standard way that generally React developers set up their project. Okay, and then in this folder, you'll create a new file with the name of the component. So in this case, it would be hello.js. And then I would just declare that component in here. So function hello. And then we just write a return h1 hello world. And then you have to export it. So you do export default and the name of the component. And then there it is. You define this function and you've exported it from the file. So now here in app.js, what I can do instead is I can delete this hello here and import the function. So I can be like import hello from ./components/hello.js. Okay, and now it still works. So if we do the hello world. So that's typically how you're going to do it. You really want one component per file. Okay, so that way it's like just easier to kind of think through what's going on in the world. Okay, and because you write all your components in one file, the code just gets icky. Okay, so it's hard to track things. Okay, so if you have a carousel component, if you have a button component, whatever you decide to encapsulate, you put it in one file. Okay, so now that we kind of get the idea of like how you write a component and how you can write a component, where you can write a component, and the basic idea of a component, and again, literally all it is, it's a function that returns JSX. Let's talk more about JSX. What are the rules of JSX? Notice how I have everything wrapped in one div. So literally everything that's inside this JSX is inside the div. One of the rules of JSX is there can only be one parent element. Okay, so I can't do this. I can't have that div and then have an h1 outside of it. Because see, I get this error. JSX expressions must have one parent element. Okay, essentially each JSX expression is really one HTML tag with stuff inside of it. That's essentially what it is. What you can do is if I wanted to, I could wrap this in an array. So I could make this an array, just wrap these in square brackets and then put a comma between the different JSX expressions. Okay, and now it's okay with it. So you see like here, now I can see hello world. Okay. And well, not quite exactly what I wanted to see. Just hit refresh. Yep, and so you see hello world. You see all three of them, and then that's fine. The reason being is because these are two separate JSX expressions, so you're no longer breaking the rule. Now again, this whole array thing doesn't look very nice, so what they did is they gave you a nice little shortcut in React, so that way you can write it the way you want without having to like think about setting it up as an array. And the way that works is that instead of using square brackets and commas and setting it up as an array, I just use an empty opening and closing bracket. This is referred to as a fragment. But really what's going on under the hood is that when you wrap this up, basically under the hood when it gets rendered, it's just going to break it up into that array anyways. It just saves you the effort of having to like separate the pieces. Okay, and that just makes it a lot nice and tighter so you can just write all the HTML that you want. Okay. And now that rules out the window. Component names have to be uppercase. Okay, so keep in mind they have to be uppercase. All tags must close. So you see this opening div has a closing div. My component tag is self-closing. I don't have to self-close it. I could have an opening and closing tag, so I could do this. Okay, you typically don't need to because there's really nothing you're going to be putting here in the middle. There are situations where you might, but that's a little bit more advanced. So typically you're going to kind of write your components like this, where basically you're just self-closing. You're just saying, hey, I want the stuff from that component here. Okay. Also, notice how I don't write the word class when it comes to CSS. So if you want to add a class in JSX, what you're going to do is you're going to write class name. Why? Because the word class is already used in JavaScript for classes. So in that case, it would cause issues. Usually, if you write class, it'll work, but it'll warn you. But just to make sure you don't avoid all problems, you generally want to use class name instead of class. Okay. And by default, they provide you with this app. And that's another thing people will do is they'll create like a CSS file per component, and then what you do is you import the CSS file. Just keep in mind when you do that, just because you're importing different CSS files into different components, it doesn't necessarily mean that CSS only applies to that component. It will be treated as a global CSS. So typically what you do is that generally in your components, like let's say I wanted to create like a CSS file for this hello component, I would create new, and I would just like do hello.css. And then here in the hello.js, I can import the CSS file. So import ./CSS. But what I would do is I would give the h1 its own class. Usually I'd give it like the component's name. And then you use style that in your CSS, and I would style like .hello and go, say like color red. And now you can see that the two that were created by the component, they have the red color. And then now it's like hello world. If you don't want to do that, you could just use this CSS file here, index.css, and just literally put all your CSS for your entire project there. And again, it doesn't matter what file the code is written in, all the CSS is global. Okay, so if you import a CSS file here or there, it's global. Like this index.css file is imported here in the index.js file. Just so you see like where these things are coming from. But that would probably be in the early stages of React. That's how I would approach your styling. I would just use that index.css, do all your styling in there until you get more comfortable with just React as a whole before you start exploring a lot of these other cool ways you can kind of like organize your CSS in React. But yeah, that's essentially it. Again, when it comes to writing JSX, remember there's one parent element. Okay, you got to use class name instead of class. Okay, if you do want to have like break some of these rules, then you can write it inside of a fragment. And then that's pretty much it for now. What I would do now is just maybe write some like basic components, like try to write like a button component, or where basically it just renders a button. So for example, something like this. So I'll just do it right here just to kind of quickly show you. Actually, I'll just do it properly. New file, button.js. I might as well just do the whole button.css thing too. Button.css. So then what I do here is I can create a function called the button that returns a button with the class name of button. Okay. And then you notice like that's not super useful because the button's always going to say word, and we'll see that we'll take care of that in the next video. But now I'll just style the button a little bit. So dot button was a class, and I'm going to just say like the color is white, background color black. Okay, now if I go back to my app.js and I import the button component, import button from ./components/ button. And then again, I can just use like that button multiple times. And each button is a unique button. So I'm creating 3 different buttons. Let's see here, what does it like? Import it as a button. Oh, I never actually export it. That would help. So don't forget, when you write a component, you got to do that whole export default. You got to export it, or else it doesn't know that it was. Okay. And you see now I have these 3 buttons. Now they're not styled. Let's examine why that's the case. Class name button. Oh, I never imported the button.css. That would help. Import ./button CSS. And there you go. Okay. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great day and enjoy.